Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Attraction, Love, Sex, The Inside Story by Simon Levay, narrated by Calley. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures present in the print and ebook formats of the book. Preface. In 2021 alone, according to Google Scholar, over 200,000 newly published academic articles and books included the word sex or sexual in their titles. Keeping up with this flood of material, let alone with the countless articles and books that cover sexual matters without using those terms, would require reading one publication every 2 minutes, with no time off for eating, sleeping, or sex. Lacking that degree of fortitude, I've decided to pick a few topics out of the general field of sexuality and a few studies within each field that illustrate the overall message I want to convey: that sex, in spite of its sexiness, is an appropriate subject for rational inquiry, just like any other aspect of human nature. We can learn something interesting and important about ourselves by viewing sex through a scientific lens. Things that may seem obvious, like why we have sex in the first place, become unobvious when we look at them closely. It has taken clear thinking, clever experimentation, and vigorous debate to find answers. Many questions are not yet fully resolved. Some remain complete mysteries. I'm lead author of a college textbook of human sexuality. What I found in the course of working on that text, and from lecturing, is that both students and instructors want decisive answers, facts, in other words, that lend themselves to the setting or sitting of exams. This book, though, is not a textbook, and so I feel no need to shy away from the uncertainties and loose ends. Listeners may sometimes find this incompleteness frustrating, but that's how science works. Scientific progress is like the slow retreat of a morning fog, when advancing sunlight opens up some vistas while leaving others in obscurity. Perhaps a few listeners will be spurred to join the scientific enterprise, to answer one of the unanswered questions, or to pose a question that no one has yet thought to ask. To those listeners who are already engaged in sex research, I apologize if I don't do full justice to your work, if I credit it to your lab chief when it was all your inspiration and hard work, or if I failed to mention it entirely. Believe me, I've been there. By way of excuse, I can only repeat the earlier statistic: over 200,000 publications on sex every year. Also, in areas of research where I'm not familiar with the participants, I've had to deduce who were the prime movers from the sequence of authors of a publication, which is not always a reliable indicator. Scientific writing can be daunting on account of the jargon. The brain is the worst. Researchers are constantly dividing this organ into ever smaller parts with distinct connections and functions, so we end up with names like the ventrolateral division of the ventromedial nucleus of the hypothalamus, a tiny neuronal group whose role in sexual behavior I discuss in Chapter 3. I've done my best to avoid technical terms, but short of trivializing the whole subject, I've been obliged to include quite a few. I define these when I first mention them. 1. Why have sex? Why have sex? A dumb question, perhaps. Maybe you've already come up with an obvious answer. But when we probe a little deeper, it turns out to be one of the trickier questions that science has grappled with. Let's start by asking people for their own thoughts on the matter, or rather, by reviewing a couple of studies that have done this for us. What we'll learn is that there are 237 reasons why people have sex, or, alternatively, just one big reason. What people tell us. That figure of 237 reasons comes from a research paper published a few years ago in the Archives of Sexual Behavior. The paper was titled plainly enough, Why Humans Have Sex. It was written by Cindy Meston and David Buss of the University of Texas at Austin. Meston is a clinical psychologist and sex researcher. Buss is an evolutionary psychologist. Both are highly regarded in their fields. To gather their data, Meston and Buss asked their psychology students to List all the reasons you can think of why you, or someone you have known, has engaged in sexual intercourse in the past. The most frequent reason given by both men and women was, I was attracted to the person. The least frequent reason given by women was, I wanted to give someone else a sexually transmitted disease. The least frequent reason given by men was, the person offered to give me drugs for doing it. Between these two extremes, the list featured a wide spectrum of reasons, from the mundane to the exotic. I was curious about sex. The person was too hot to resist. I wanted to get out of doing something. I wanted to change the topic of conversation. It was an initiation rite. I wanted to get closer to God, or it just happened. Notably absent from the list was any reason connected with procreation. No, I wanted to get pregnant. No, we wanted to have a baby. No, it was time to start a family. The only reason that may have had some connection with procreation was number 152. I was married and you're supposed to. But if that was a reference to childbearing, it was an oblique one at best. Meston and Buss did a good job with this study, in my opinion. Still, it did have some obvious limitations. How well chosen were the participants, for example, for a study that purported to tell us why humans have sex? All University of Texas psychology students are humans, for sure, but not all humans are psychology students. What about those who are not? Let's take a 7,600-mile hop southeastward from Austin. This brings us to the rainforest of Africa's Congo Basin, home of the Aka, a pygmy hunter-gatherer people. The lives of the Aka have been studied over many years by the anthropologists Barry and Bonnie Hewlett of Washington State University. Here's what the Hewletts report regarding the Aka people's sex lives. Couples engage in sexual intercourse about 3 nights of every week, and 3 to 4 times during each of those active nights. They continue to have sex at about this rate throughout their fertile years. The Aka couples might have sex for the same reasons that Texas psychology students do, of course. They might find their partners too hot to resist, for example. But that isn't the reason they gave the Hewletts. Rather, both women and men described having frequent sex as a chore, as hard work, necessitated by their desire to have as many babies as possible. Some Akas did concede that sex could be pleasurable, but pleasure was not their stated motive for engaging in it. The reason for the Aka's desire for many children was twofold: the high rates of infant and child mortality in the Aka population, and the economic and social advantages conferred by having a large family. I'm now doing it 5 times a night to search for a child, one young Aka man told the Hewletts. If I do not do it 5 times, my wife will not be happy because she wants children quickly. To keep up this level of performance, Aka men chew on the bark of a certain tree they call columba. This may be Porzenistalia yohimbe, a tree in the coffee family whose bark is the source of the sexual stimulant yohimbine. The Aka believe in a concept called seminal nurture, the idea that a pregnant woman's fetus requires an ongoing supply of semen for it to survive and grow. This belief is incorrect. As a biologist, rather than a cultural anthropologist, I am permitted to say this. In fact, if feeding the fetus were the point of the exercise, oral sex would be marginally more useful than vaginal sex, because a man's ejaculate does offer a few calories. Although seminal nurture doesn't help a fetus grow, frequent sex does increase the likelihood that a woman will become pregnant for several reasons. Most acts of intercourse are mistimed with respect to the woman's date of ovulation. Those that are well timed may not lead to fertilization, and many fertilized eggs die before they ever implant in the woman's uterus. Thus, the Aka's belief in seminal nurture, mistaken or not, may be useful in the context of a need to have many children. Along the same lines, the Aka seem not to practice, or even be aware of, non-procreative sexual activities such as masturbation or sex between 2 men or 2 women. With regard to masturbation, the Hewletts relate the experience of a medical anthropologist, Robert Bailey of the University of Illinois at Chicago, who wanted to obtain semen samples from men of other pygmy people. Bailey had to give the men detailed instructions on how to masturbate, and although the men did come back with semen samples, all but one of the samples contained vaginal secretions mixed in with the semen. All in all, the peoples of the Congo rainforest have sex to make babies, and they don't seem to know of any other reason. How can two different groups of people, American psychology students and African hunter-foragers, come up with such different motives for having sex? Part of the answer, of course, is that the Americans were college students. Making babies doesn't rank high on most students' to-do lists. It probably ranks high on their not-to-do lists. Yet they are not alone in this. According to an analysis by the Guttmacher Institute, the average American woman spends 31 years of her life avoiding pregnancy, something that would be unthinkable to ARCA women. Furthermore, a question starting with, "Please list all the reasons you can think of," as Meston and Buss's question did, may be interpreted more as a challenge to creativity than a probe of the participants' actual motivations. It sounds like one of those open-ended IQ questions like, "List all the uses you can think of for a copy of Psychology Today," in which you can get credit for swatting flies, starting campfires, and so on. That's very different from how the Hewletts probed the sexual motivation of the ARCA men and women. Meston and Buss's study was not really about why humans have sex. It was about what people say when they are asked why they have sex. But by and large, people don't know why they do the things they do, and so they can't tell you. That doesn't stop them from giving you some answer, though, because the human mind is a wonderful confabulator. We need to dig deeper if we want to understand why humans have sex. One direction to dig is deep into the brain so that we can inspect the inner mechanisms that underlie sexual desire and behavior. That's something I'll attempt in later chapters. For now, I want to dig in a different direction, deep into the past, into the question, why has sex evolved? Or, given that it has evolved, why doesn't it disappear? What mud snails tell us. It's natural for us humans to think that sex is necessary because if everyone gave up on sex, our species would quickly go extinct. But why shouldn't we reproduce by splitting in two, like amoebas? If that's too far-fetched a notion, why shouldn't we all be female and reproduce by virgin birth? Or parthenogenesis as it's called, as some lizards do. Why do we reproduce by sex, a messy, time-wasting and disease-spreading activity that, among other problems, requires the invention of a superfluous gender, males? It's easier to think of reasons why we shouldn't reproduce sexually than reasons why we should. Some simple arithmetic makes this clear. Think about a female who reproduces sexually. Let's say she's capable of having 4 offspring, 2 daughters and 2 sons. The next generation will consist of the offspring of the 2 daughters, that is, 8 individuals in total. The next generation will consist of 16 individuals, the next 32, and so on. The numbers will double with each generation until their multiplication is limited by external factors, such as a limited food supply. That sounds efficient, until you compare it with the situation for a female who reproduces asexually, like those lizards. This female's 4 offspring will be like herself, so all will be asexually reproducing females. The next generation will consist of 16 females, the next 64, and so on. The numbers quadruple with each generation. Thus, if the 2 populations are sharing the same environment, the asexually reproducing individuals will rapidly outnumber those that reproduce sexually. Other things being equal, they will monopolize the available resources, causing the sexually reproducing lineage to die out. This twofold cost of sexual reproduction, caused by the necessity to produce males, was initially pointed out by the British evolutionary biologist John Maynard Smith in the 1970s. Maynard Smith's paper was a theoretical exercise, but it has since been observed in real life. Not in humans, of course, but in a species of tiny snail that lives in the lakes and streams of New Zealand, the New Zealand mud snail, or Potamopicus antipodarum. What's interesting about these snails is that the females come in 2 kinds. One kind reproduces sexually, that is, it mates with males, The other dispenses with males and reproduces asexually. Over the last several decades, the snails have been studied by a group led by the evolutionary biologist Curtis Lively of Indiana University. They studied the snails in Lake Alexandrina, which is on the South Island near nowhere in particular, which makes it the perfect site for field research. Between 2012 and 2016, Lively, along with his wife, Linda Delph, who is also a biology professor at Indiana University, and a graduate student, Amanda Gibson, took the long trip to Lake Alexandrina every southern summer, thus skipping a big chunk of the Indiana winter. P. antipodarum is a globally invasive species now found, for example, in Lake Michigan, just a few hours' drive from Indiana University. Presumably, it's more than just the weather that necessitates the trip to New Zealand. Gibson, who is now an assistant professor at the University of Virginia, told me that the protocol was as follows. Lively donned a wetsuit and swam around with a fine mesh net, sweeping it through the shallow water vegetation. It's somewhat unusual and laudable that a senior professor had time and inclination to do this. Gibson stood in the shallows and received the full nets, whose contents she rinsed to get rid of the large debris. She then handed the snails to Delph, who labelled and packaged them for the conveyance to the Edward Percival Field Station, located north of Christchurch. There, all three researchers separated out the tiny juvenile snails, a mix of sexual and asexual individuals, and put them in outdoor tanks, about 800 to a tank. They then went home to Indiana, leaving the snails to fend for themselves. By the time Lively's group returned to New Zealand the following summer, the previous year's juvenile snails had matured into adults and produced offspring of their own. Gibson took samples of the adult females and their offspring back to Lively's lab at Indiana University. To determine the proportions of sexual versus asexual animals, she took advantage of the fact that the asexual snails possess 3 sets of chromosomes in each cell nucleus, whereas the sexual snails possess only 2 sets, the normal number in most animals. So the asexual snails have more DNA in each cell nucleus than the sexual snails. She ran hundreds of cell nuclei from each animal through a device called a flow cytometer, which measures the amount of DNA in each nucleus as it is carried past a sensor in a fast-running stream of fluid. Gibson found that the asexual females had indeed produced relatively more offspring than the sexual females, and this was true in all 4 years that she repeated the experiment. In fact, the relative numbers of sexually and asexually reproducing snails corresponded closely to what one would expect based on Maynard Smith's theoretical argument. This study showed for the first time that the cost of sex, more specifically the cost of producing males, is real, and not just the product of a mathematical exercise. In other words, asexual females do have a major advantage over sexual females, at least in P. antipodarum. One idea, the Red Queen. Nevertheless, sexual snails haven't disappeared, nor have sexual humans or any other of the multitude of species, over 99% of all animals and plants, in which sex is either the necessary or an optional means of reproduction. Therefore, there must be something about sex that offers an advantage over virgin birth, an advantage great enough to compensate for Maynard Smith's twofold cost of producing males. Not just that twofold cost, in fact, but also the substantial costs of finding mates, persuading them to have sex with you, actually getting it on, and contracting whatever diseases your partners may have picked up in the course of their earlier conjugations. The key feature of sexual reproduction is that individuals inherit a mixture of genes from their parents, half from one and half from the other. Which genes come from which parent is a matter of chance. Each sibling inherits a different mix, unless they are identical twins. What's the advantage of mixing genes? Many theories have been put forward, but there are 2 main ideas, both of which are likely to be part of the answer. The first is that when genes are mixed, they sometimes end up in a combination that provides a defense against a novel external threat. The threat could be of any kind, but the one that has been most widely discussed is infection by microorganisms or parasites. These organisms are capable of rapid change. When they change, combinations of genes that have previously protected animals against infection may suddenly lose their efficacy. But the shuffling of genes during the process of sexual reproduction means that some individuals in the next generation may have combinations that restore protection. Only a few individuals will get these useful combinations, but those are the ones that survive and reproduce. This scenario is a never-ending process. The pathogens change their attacks, the animals change their defenses, the pathogens change again, and so on. It's a running battle just to remain as successful as you were before. For that reason, this explanation for sexual reproduction has been called the Red Queen model, after the Red Queen in Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, who told Alice that it takes all the running you can do to stay in the same place. The Red Queen model may explain why the sexual snails studied by Gibson are not crowded out of existence by the asexual parthenogenetic snails, even though the latter can multiply much more rapidly. In Lake Alexandrina, snails risk being parasitized by a certain flatworm whose eggs the snails may inadvertently ingest. The eggs hatch inside the snail, and the resulting larvae, like aliens in a horror movie, devour every part of the snail that can be eaten without actually killing it. These non-vital parts include the genitals, so the infected snails lose the ability to reproduce. In her experiments, Gibson took care to use only uninfected snails, and in their absence, the cost of sex, slower propagation, was evident. In the natural situation, however, this cost may be balanced by the advantage of resistance against the flatworms. Some further observations on the mud snails support the Red Queen model. Lively's group found that the sexually reproducing females were most common in parts of Lake Alexandrina where ingesting flatworm eggs was more likely to occur. In parts of the lake where there were few eggs, asexual females were more common. This suggested that ever-changing attacks by the parasites promoted the form of reproduction in which new, protective gene combinations could be rapidly assembled. What's more, Lively and colleagues found that over many seasons, the proportions of asexual and sexual snails and the proportions of infected and uninfected snails in these two populations rose and fell periodically in a manner predicted by the Red Queen model. Another idea: rubies in the rubbish. The other idea about why sex is so popular has to do with mutations, changes to an organism's genome that may affect its ability to survive and reproduce. This model proposes that sexual reproduction exists because it helps get rid of harmful mutations and preserve beneficial ones. A newborn human child inherits an average of about 70 new mutations that its parents did not themselves inherit. This figure was obtained in an Icelandic study that compared the entire genomes of parents and their children. The mutations crop up in the parents' germlines, the lineages of cells that develop into sperm or ova. Most mutations occur in the process of cell division. It takes far more rounds of cell division to produce sperm than to produce ova, because a man must generate billions of sperm over his lifetime, whereas a woman creates only 1 million or so ova, and these are already present in an immature state when a girl is born. Thus, the great majority of new mutations are inherited from a child's father, and the older the father is, the more new mutations he is likely to pass on. Many mutations have little or no effect, so the child of an older father may not be impaired in any way. Of those mutations that do have an effect, however, the great majority are harmful, and only a small number are beneficial. That's hardly surprising. You seldom improve computer software by introducing random changes, and the same is true for the genome. When a species reproduces asexually, natural selection can preserve beneficial mutations, but harmful mutations inevitably come along for the ride. They are unwelcome hitchhikers on the road to the future. And when beneficial mutations arise, it's not likely that they will all arise in the same line of animals, so they can't be combined. Instead, they may end up competing with each other, which often causes one of them to be lost. When a species reproduces sexually, on the other hand, the random mixing of genes causes the genomes of the offspring to differ from each other. Thus, the relative numbers of harmful and beneficial mutations vary from individual to individual. Some have more than their share of harmful mutations, and some have more than their share of beneficial ones. This potential for sexual gene mixing to separate good from bad mutations increases the power of natural selection to work its magic. Individuals with mostly good mutations reproduce more, while those with mostly bad mutations reproduce less, so the genomes with good mutations come to predominate in the population. According to this model, then, the important difference between asexual and sexual reproduction is this. With asexual reproduction, natural selection sees the entire genome as a unit. With sexual reproduction, it sees individual mutations, preserving the good ones and removing the bad ones. This advantage for sexual reproduction has been called the ruby in the rubbish model. The phrase was invented by the British evolutionary biologist Joel Peck. What yeast tells us. An incisive test of the rubies in the rubbish model was published in 2016 by a team at Harvard University, led by the evolutionary biologist Michael McDonald. McDonald is now at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. This group studied brewer's yeast, a unicellular organism named Saccharomyces cerevisiae that has become a workhorse of not only brewers, but also molecular biologists. The yeast can be induced to reproduce either sexually or asexually by varying the conditions in which it is grown. The researchers maintained some samples of yeast cells in conditions in which they reproduced asexually, and others in which they reproduced sexually. Each sample consisted initially of a clone, a set of genetically identical cells. After the cells had been allowed to reproduce for about 1,000 generations, the researchers tested the fitness of the sexual and asexual cells by running the cells in head-to-head competition with the ancestral strain from which they were derived. They found that both kinds of cells had increased in fitness. They outpropagated their ancestors, but the sexual cells had done so to a much greater degree than the asexual cells. The result was expected, based on previous work, but McDonald's group added a new level of analysis to the experiment, an analysis made possible by the precipitous drop in the cost of DNA sequencing in recent years. They sequenced the entire genomes of both the sexual and asexual populations at intervals of 90 generations over the entire 1,000-generation experiment. By this method, they identified the mutations as they occurred and followed them over time. The researchers then assayed the harmfulness or benefit of each mutation by transferring the mutation into the ancestral line of yeast and competing this modified line against the unmodified ancestral line. If the new line grew better than the ancestral line, the mutation was a beneficial one. If it grew less well, the mutation was harmful. By these means, McDonald and his team were able to reconstruct the history of all the mutations as they appeared and survived or disappeared over the course of the experiment. It was rather like charting the life histories of all the characters in an especially convoluted film noir. What were the findings? In the asexual population, many harmful mutations persisted up to the end of the experiment, by virtue of their unbreakable connections to beneficial mutations. Meanwhile, some beneficial mutations died out in the face of competition from different beneficial mutations in other lines within the population. In the sexual population, by contrast, the mixing of genes allowed the good and bad mutations to separate into different lines. The cell lines with bad mutations were reduced in number or eliminated, while those with good mutations persisted. In fact, many of the beneficial mutations vanquished all their competitors, meaning that every surviving cell in the population carried the mutation. McDonald's findings certainly don't disprove the Red Queen model. What they do show is that the ruby in the rubbish model works as theory had predicted, in yeast anyway. The Red Queen model probably also works in some situations, especially when novel environmental threats are frequently encountered. What about more complex creatures such as humans? The relevance of the Ruby and the Rubbish model is made clear by examining.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?